morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're now going to get started. I'm Christy Schmidt, Assistant Director for Knowledge Exchange and Communications with Farm Credit East. Just a few technology reminders before we get started. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. Every once in a while, just be sure to tap your mouse so that your screen doesn't go to sleep during the presentation. And there will be time for questions and answers at the end of each presentation. But you can also text chat them in throughout the presentation whenever you think of them, and then they'll all be held to ask of Andy at the end. And you can text chat them in the box on the right side of your screen. There's a red arrow. If you expand that, you'll see a text chat box there. And also, a recording of today's presentation will be available on farmcrediteast.com/webinars for playback at a later time, and that'll probably be available on Monday. And now I'll turn it over to Bob Smith.
Good morning, everyone. We appreciate your participation today. This is Bob Smith, also with Farm Credit East Knowledge Exchange. I want to welcome you to this webinar on the Dairy Margin Protection Program. As most of you know, with the 2014 Farm Bill, we no longer have the MILC program and no longer have the Dairy Price Support Program. We now have a new program, Margin Protection Program. And that's what the focus of today's webinar is on. That program is not automatic for producers. Producers that want to participate have to sign up, and that sign up is within a month now. So we appreciate your interest in being on this webinar and evaluating the program as to whether it fits your farm and at what level you might want to participate. I want to thank our co-sponsors before we get started here. NEDPA, Northeast Dairy Producers Association, New York Farm Bureau, and Cornell Pro Dairy are all great organizations that we work with very closely and collaborate on a number of issues, and we appreciate their co-sponsorship of this webinar. We are really pleased today to have really one of the national, if not international, experts on dairy policy and dairy programs that there is with us today. Dr. Andrew Novakovic is a good friend of Farm Credit East, a great friend of Northeast agriculture, and we greatly appreciate the fact he's with us today. Andy is the E.V. Baker Professor of Agricultural Economics at Cornell University. He focuses on applied research and extension responsibilities relating to dairy markets, dairy policy. He's the author of over 300 publications. You know, one of the key things Andy was involved in, now going back about 5 years ago, he chaired the Dairy Industry Advisory Committee that Secretary Vilsack put together on dairy policy coming out of the 2009 downturn. Severe downturn in dairy prices, farm milk prices. He has his PhD from Purdue University. He's just a great friend of agriculture and a real expert on dairy policy. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Andy. Andy's going to go through an overview of the program, some of the tools and strategies that make sense or that you should consider, that producers may want to consider. And then we will open it up for whatever questions. I do want to note something before I turn it over to Andy. At the end, we'll have a couple slides, and we'll show this, but farmcrediteast.com, we have a farm bill page that has a lot of different information on the farm bills and links to sites that include tools for MPP. It also has information, you know, one of the things going on right now is the comment period on the Margin Protection Program is still open. USDA is looking for information on intergenerational transfer and how the program relates to intergenerational transfers. Senator Leahy's office has been very active in this area and has urged USDA to seek input and are urging producers to provide input into that, specific situations as to what the impact should be on the base production, et cetera, when you have an intergenerational transfer of a farm. So we're going to put some information on farmcrediteast.com on that issue. Okay, with that, I want to turn this over to Andy. Andy, we really appreciate your commitment to getting the information out on this. So folks, let's welcome Andy Novakovic. Andy?
Well, thank you, Bob. I am pleased to be able to visit with you. I'm going to kind of assume that most of the participants today have already been exposed to some of the basic structure and rules and design of this program. And what I'd like to focus on is really more different ways we can think about how we make an election decision. What are my strategies? What are my goals? How can I use this program? And to what purpose can I use this program? So the basic design, of course, focuses around this new measure of what we sort of generically have called income over feed cost. More generally, we're calling it margin. The actual official name in the legislation and in the rule book is actual dairy producer margin, which I find, just a little bit amusing, because it's not the margin of any actual dairy producer, and it's not any dairy producer's actual margin. This name we give it kind of makes it sound like it's my margin or it's somebody's margin. But one of the keys to understanding what to do with this program is figuring out what it is that this indicator is really measuring and how that relates to my situation, and what does it mean when I pick a threshold coverage of 8, 6, 4, or whatever in between. But of course, the basic program works off of this one national indicator, this one national measure. And if in a period of 2 months, the national average of that margin goes below the threshold that you pick on your coverage election, you get paid the difference on a quantity of milk that is derived from your production history in combination with a percentage coverage level that you choose. That defines a certain dollar amount, and once all those numbers are calculated, you get a check in the following month. That's the simple explanation of what this is. I think a very fundamental first question is, why would I even think about being in MPP dairy? It's certainly not my job to sell this program to you or anybody else, but I would offer that there are at least 3 reasons why it's at least worth thinking about participating in the program. One is probably pretty obvious to everyone. We're going to continue to have rough spots, and those rough spots may not very often be as dramatic as they were in 2009 or 2012, which is illustrated on that graph on the right-hand side. But there certainly are going to be periods that are bad enough. I mean, if we look at 2000, 2002, 2003, 2006, those were periods I often refer to as normal lows or normal bad periods, not the dramatic, catastrophic periods that we had in 2009, 2012. And if those felt like they were bad enough to deserve some attention, then I would say we can certainly expect to see those again. The chart on the left-hand side shows the price of milk and the feed cost that comes from the calculation that's done in the margin protection program. It combines corn, soybean meal, and hay. And I think what I would draw your attention to is that the real volatility, the real up and down, the cyclical volatility is really being driven by the price of milk. And what we've seen in terms of feed costs isn't so much an up and down as it is the shock of an event. And of course, there are times when we have kind of the usual weather-related shock that affects yields or affects harvest on any of the crops, corn, beans, and even hay. But beyond that, we've had this tremendous ethanol effect, which certainly drove us to these depths of lows in 2009 and 2012, but probably is pretty well played out. And the notion that we're now going to be in a range of $3 to $4 corn is pretty easy to expect. And weather will have its role, but probably not give us the dramatic bounces. So when we think about these rough periods, I think we might be moving into an era where, by and large, most of those ups and downs are going to be defined by the price of milk, not so much the price of feed. Of course, that doesn't mean this program loses any of its validity, but I think it also might get us thinking about what other risk management tools might come into play based on the source of this volatility. A second reason for this program is simply this is it. Now, there are plenty of private sector tools that continue to be available, but there is no more MILC. The price support program is on the books, but it's not going to be used. You can continue to use LGM dairy if you're one of the few people who want to do that, but in terms of a program that has demonstrated broad appeal, this is probably going to be the one that you've got to look at without too many other options. And every one of you is going to have to judge whether or not you think this is a good deal. But I would simply offer that folks who have been thinking about risk management tools for a long time are pretty much of the opinion that the pricing on this program is pretty attractive. And from that standpoint, I think it offers a third reason to consider using it, giving it at least a careful consideration. It would be easy to say, gosh, this is kind of a no-brainer. It's pretty simple. Why wouldn't I sign up for it? And I don't think it's really simple at all. There's the basic question of, out of the 113 choices I've got between dollar per hundredweight threshold and percentage of milk covered, that's certainly one complication, but the other one is really thinking through carefully, what is it that I think this program is going to do for me? What does it offer to me? A lot of people are describing it as a risk management tool, and that's reasonable enough, but it's really kind of a hybrid that includes a couple different characteristics of different types of programs. Ultimately, of course, it's going to try to give you a benefit payment when things head south, but should we think of this as something more like an MILC payment that cycles in and out in periods of low prices or low margins, or is this really more like a risk management tool? And I think the key difference there is when we get our head into the risk management framework, we're thinking much more carefully about my farm, my situation, my numbers, when is it that I'm vulnerable, what can I do about it, as opposed to this broad safety net approach that we get with countercyclical payment programs like MILC. When we think about the safety net concepts, we can think about that as a price program. We can think about it as an income program. The old price support program focused on price and tried to make sure prices didn't fall below a certain level. The MILC program obviously had price included in a calculation, but basically you got a lump sum check, and it was a kind of an income supplement. Well, MILC has some similarity to MPP in the sense that you get a check, but there's also some pretty key differences. The premium is different. The fact that you've got a much more careful reflection of the feed prices in the margin calculation is quite a difference. When we put our head in the risk management, now we start to really ask these very different questions. A fundamental question, of course, is what is it that identifies my risk? What is it that what bad thing happens and what consequence am I going to struggle with if that bad thing happens, and at what level. What risk can I tolerate with my own resources, and what are my options when I get beyond that level, when I get to a lower level of return or a lower level of price or a higher level of feed cost. What is the consequence of that for me, and how can I deal with that? As I say in my little parenthetical statement here, part of it is figuring out how bad the storm is, and part of it is figuring out what my solutions are. A second part of this is, how do I measure, if we're focusing on feed costs, if we're focusing on margins, if we're focusing on income over feed costs, how do I calculate mine? Obviously, if you sell all your milk commercially and you buy all your feedstuffs commercially, that's a pretty simple calculation. But there's not really that many farmers for whom it's that simple. And when you've got homegrown feeds and so on, how do you factor all that in? Certainly it's doable, but you need to figure out how you're going to do it. And then there's the tempting question of, how do I translate my personal income over feed costs to this new national margin, the so-called actual dairy producer margin? And what is that relationship? Is it closely related or not so closely related? Is mine always smaller? Is mine always bigger? And what exactly does that mean? I know there's a lot of conversations occurring about how do I translate my margin. And I've heard people talk about, well, my margin is routinely smaller. I don't think I can even use this program. And one thing I will certainly say is, it's worthwhile to know the relationship, but don't confuse 4 to 8 on this national number as somehow constraining your own personal performance to have to be between 4 and 8. The question is the basis. The question is the relationship, not the specific number. In thinking about my personal income over feed cost, certainly one aspect is, how do I go about calculating that? What's the arithmetic that I'm going to use to calculate that? But the other one is, how does that change over time? And in this graphic representation, we're looking at the 2 farms that we pulled from farm data sets that I would say actually are pretty representative of the kind of farms that exist in the Great Lakes region from Wisconsin to New England. And these 2 farms have a pattern of income over feed costs that when you look at the left-hand graph, you would say perhaps is pretty closely correlated. The orange and the green lines are pretty similar to the black lines. One goes down, they all go down. One goes up, they all go up. They seem to occupy a pretty similar space. And it might be tempting to say there's a strong correlation here. Well, yes and no. The right-hand graph takes a look at the actual difference, the distance between the black line and the orange line, or the distance between the black line and the green line. And as you can see, for farm number 1, that distance ranges from minus $2 a hundredweight to plus 50 cents a hundredweight. In farm number 2, it ranges from minus $3 a hundredweight to about plus 30, 40 cents a hundredweight. That's a pretty big difference. And so if we're going to be comparing my income over feed costs relative to this national number, I think one of the first things we've got to realize is, don't just do it for 1 year. You do it for several years so that you can get a sense of the stability of that relationship over time. I might also particularly draw your attention on the green line. 2009 and 2012 were 2 difficult years, 2 bad years using that actual dairy producer margin. And yet on that farm number 1, we were $2 worse than the national number in 2009, but 50 cents better than the national number in 2012. So clearly there isn't an easy correlation between bad years and good years and how my personal number might relate to this national indicator. Also, if we're thinking about this from the perspective of risk management, it's certainly the case that however much like risk management tools we think MPP-DARI is, it's at least one of a bunch that we could consider. Obviously, LGM-DARI is the other tool that's offered through USDA. LGM-DARI, which is handled through the Risk Management Agency and offered by private agents, is very clearly, very definitely a risk management type tool. MPP-DARI has some of those characteristics, but obviously it's quite different. Farmers have been told you can only pick one. You can use LGM-DARI until you decide to switch to MPP-DARI, and once you're in MPP-DARI, then you're locked into it for the remainder of this farm bill. Clearly, there's a bunch of private sector tools that will continue to be available to farmers whether they use MPP-DARI or not. I think one question might be, if I do use MPP-DARI, does it impact how I might use other private sector tools? Does it make it more appealing or less appealing to hedge corn or to forward contract? And I think this is where I would suggest that if we believe that we will see greater volatility in milk than we will in feedstuffs, then perhaps our strategies for risk management in the private sector might be different for these two different items, our output milk and our input feeds, whereas MPP-DARI blends them all together. And then, of course, there's another category that you haven't seen on the list yet, which I call collective solutions, things that I think farmers can do in a private way without public help, but they kind of do collectively. And I think the best example of that is when a milk marketing cooperative or other buyer offers you a forward price contract. And I think it's certainly the case that these solutions are also well worth thinking. In combination then, if we ask ourselves, so is MPP a risk management tool? I would say it has characteristics of risk management tools, but also some key differences. And perhaps the largest difference is that MPP-DARI premiums do not vary with risk. Every year, regardless of what market outlook's like, you can buy $650 margin insurance coverage for MPP-DARI at exactly the same price. Any of you who have looked at LGM-DARI are well aware that you do not have that choice with that type of risk management tool, or for that matter, if you used options markets to get to a somewhat similar kind of combination of price floors on milk and price ceilings on corn, you would find you don't get to pick those prices wherever you want them to be. So MPP-DARI has a distinct advantage in that regard. On the other hand, MPP-DARI is one size fits all. You can't tailor it to your specific farm condition. It doesn't matter where you sell your milk and at what price. It doesn't matter what combination of feedstuffs you buy. MPP-DARI has this very rigid structure. A different issue altogether is, what do I bring to the table in terms of what I want this thing to do for me? We can ask ourselves, what is it capable of doing? But we can also ask a different question, what do I want it to do? And some of you have probably heard me characterize it this way before. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think there's these two perspectives pretty well capture how the discussion about MPP-DARI is going, at least in places where I've heard people talk about it. And one of the things that strikes me is guys like me, educators, financial advisors, even the Secretary of Agriculture talks about this as a risk management tool. and says you should do this, and this is the way you can use this as a risk management tool. But I think there are a lot of producers that are asking the question, what do I need to do to maximize my return? What do I need to do to ensure that I get more out of this thing than I put into it? If you think about it, that's a kind of an odd question if we think we're talking about insurance. Nobody buys property insurance with the question, how do I make sure I get more benefits than I have to pay in premiums when you buy property insurance? So that's not a normal question for insurance. It kind of tells us already that this MPP dairy program is a little bit different than just kind of a normal insurance program. It is certainly not my objective to tell anyone that they should think about this one way or the other. But I would say, ask yourself, which one of these descriptions better describes what you're thinking about when you look at this program? Because if you can look at that and say, this is what I want, then that goal is actually going to be very useful in understanding, what do I need to do? What kind of coverage should I be looking for if I'm expecting to get a net benefit, or if that's my goal, versus I'm trying to minimize some downside risk. So this is not an issue of right or wrong, but rather an issue of understanding how to best achieve your goals. A few of my friends and I kicked around ideas about, well, what kind of goals might a producer bring to this? And here's just a few, hopefully a few that kind of make sense to you in terms of thinking about how a producer might look at this. And once you've got this goal, what do you do with it? How do you implement that goal? And there's a couple, I'm going to come back to this again in a later slide, but there's a couple that I think I've certainly heard people talk about quite a bit. One is the notion of just get the catastrophic coverage. It's only $100, get your $4 margin, and then at least you've protected yourself in the case of the most severe event. A lot of people have asked, how much would I have to cover if I wanted to get a payment comparable to MILC? Well, of course, that depends a lot on whether or not you were under the payment cap or way above the payment cap and so on. But we actually took a look at that. One of them that I think is also pretty interesting is the notion of saying, I'm going to decide how much coverage level I pick based on a budget that I for my premiums. So I'm going to decide I can spend $10,000 on premiums, or $50,000, or $2,000, or whatever your number might be, and then just ask the question, okay, if I'm going to spend $10,000 on premiums, what can I get for $10,000? Let's just take a look at a couple of those. This graph takes a look at MILC payments from 2002 to 2013 and compares them to the payments you would get had there been an MPP program over that same time period, and you had chosen the catastrophic coverage level of $4 a hundredweight, or $650, which many people have suggested is kind of a sweet spot, for up a spot that may be fairly popular as a combination of opportunity for benefit versus the cost. And as you can see, there are some years in which MILC made payments that MPP would not have made payments at this coverage level. And pretty much what that tells you, MILC was triggered by price. And in those periods where you see blue bars and no green bars, that says you had a low price event, but the price of feed was low. So the margin actually wasn't so bad, even though the price of milk had drifted down. In other periods, notably 2009 and 2012, but also 2013, the green bars, the MPP bars, are well above, or the 651 is well above MILC, which is saying you had a very strong feed effect. Prices were low, but milk prices were low, but feed costs were even higher. So you can't expect these calculations to come out precisely in any one year, but over a span of time, as was indicated in the previous slide, you may have noticed, it looks like 550 MPP coverage would have yielded a total dollar payout over the period of a decade, pretty similar to MILC. So if you wanted to say, okay, I was good with MILC, what do I need to do for MPP dairy? This would suggest that maybe 550 is that level. But keep in mind that if you have a different combination of milk prices and feed prices, that margin payment at 550 may or may not have given you a payment that MILC would have. So this is an approximation, certainly no guarantee. This is an example of using the budget approach. If you decided you wanted to spend, or were able to spend, or willing to spend $5,000 on premiums, total premiums, and you had a 4 million pound production history, what could you get? Well, obviously, you can get a lower dollar per hundredweight threshold over a larger volume of milk, or vice versa. In this particular example, the math works out so that going from $7 to $8 means that you're going to cover 1/3 as much milk as you would at the lower level. Obviously, the premiums ramp up pretty quickly at that high dollar range, and so $8 is quite a bit more expensive than $7, even in this lower tier level. And this raises, I think, the important question that everyone has to ask, whether they're on a fixed budget strategy or not. Do you think you want to have coverage that dollar per hundredweight is bigger, or number of months is more frequent, even if it comes at the expense of the total magnitude of the benefit? Do you want that $8 coverage giving you a bigger dollar per hundredweight benefit happening more often, even if it only pays on 25% of your production history? And I think there are clearly strategies where you could rationally pick one or the other, and it's worthwhile to think through that question. And I would say the key is understanding both the magnitude of the coverages affected, the magnitude of the difference between the actual margin and your threshold, but also how often that's going to happen, because obviously you're going to be below $8 more often than you're below 6 or below 4. In fact, that's what is being illustrated in this slide. The green line is, of course, the margin, this national actual dairy producer margin from 2000 until this last summer. And what it's showing is that if you look at the $4 threshold, there are 2 periods in the last 15 years where that margin protection program would have kicked in, and would have for several months in 2009 and 2012. If you look at the $8 margin, the maximum coverage, it kicks in 2000, in 2002, 2003, a little bit in 2004, 2006, of course 2009, 2010, 2012, 2013, pretty often. So this is, I think, a very vivid demonstration of the more frequent payments as well as the depth of the payment. The orange line is 650. Obviously, it's an intermediate point, and what I would draw your attention to is, of course, the 650 coverage gave you a bigger payment in those 2 catastrophic periods of 2009 and 2012. It also kicked in 2013 and in 2002, 2003, but it doesn't give you much in 2006. Now, for those of you who were milking cows 10, 15 years ago, I'd invite you to try to remember what 2006 felt like. to try to remember what 2002 and 2003 felt like. And I certainly remember that when those periods occurred, there was plenty of conversation about this isn't any fun. This is tough sledding. When we got to 2009 and 2012, we got a whole new definition of what tough sledding looks like. But ask yourself, if it happened again, could I tolerate a financial event like 2006? Could I tolerate a financial event like we had in 2002 and 2003? And if your answer is, yep, I can do that, I don't need any help, I can take care of that myself, great. But if it's if you got a different answer, if you go, ooh, that was a little tough, I wouldn't mind having a little help, then take a look at what 650 covers and realize that in order to get any significant help out of this program, you may need to look at something more aggressive than that 650 level. So I think historically we can get some insights to say what coverage level would have protected me and how did I do then, and am I better positioned now than I was back then, or actually am I more vulnerable now than I was back then? Hopefully you've all had a chance to see some demonstration of the tool that we have online on dairymarkets.org. I hope you've had a chance to play with it. I'm not going to demonstrate the tool in this discussion. I'm going to assume that you've already had some familiarity with it, so I'm going to kind of jump in the middle here a little bit, and we'll take a look at some of the screenshots. What I want to focus on is the part of the tool that does the margin forecasting, the part that tries to help you evaluate what might possibly happen next year. And in the tool, we calculate premiums that are based on the USDA formula. They are the actual premium payments that would occur for whatever margin threshold and covered production history you choose. And then we calculate expected benefit payments. Now, this is a little bit of an important nuance to understand. If we know that the margin is going to be $9 a hundredweight, then we know there won't be any benefit payments because the most you can cover is 8. But we typically don't know what the future price of milk is going to be or the future price of corn. We might have an estimate, and that estimate may round out to $9 a hundredweight margin, but we also know that an estimate is not a certain event. There's a probability around it. The price of milk could be higher, price of milk could be lower, and of course the same with corn and hay and soybean meal. And what this tool tries to do, what it in fact does, is it uses information from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange futures and options markets to give some definition to what those probabilities are, so that we can look at something like this, which is a graph of not only the margin for a particular month, but actually the probability that it's $5, $6, $7, $8, 17, 18, 19, 20. And as you might imagine, when you start to get really big numbers or really small numbers, the probability is pretty low. When you get something in the middle, the probability is pretty high. But that's what we're trying to accomplish when we say, let's take a look at the expected value. We're trying to take into account not just the most likely event at the top of the chart, but also the possibility that you could be higher or lower around that most likely event. When you look at the tool, it's displayed in this fashion. If you've been to the tool website, you recognize this screen. This is taking a look at 2015 CME estimates. These were calculated in August, the end of August. I'm going to show you a more recent number, but just to get an idea what this table looks like, this is a screenshot I've used before. And it says, okay, on the top line, the row that's labeled expected, it says my best guess, my single best guess of one number for the margin, 1295, 1534, 1323. We get into 2015, 1138, 1073. That's my single best guess. And if you looked at that and you believed that was the number, you'd say, well, don't sign up for MPP at all. You're not going to get a payment. The threshold's $8. Why would you sign up for any coverage if you knew the margin was going to be $10 and you're never going to get paid? But you don't know that. You know it could be better, but it also could be worse. And that's what the percentages are trying to tell you. Based on what information we can drag out of Chicago Mercantile Exchange transactions in the options markets, we can say in November, December of 2015, my expected margin on this date was $10.50, but there's a 22% chance it'll be less than $8. So basically 1 in 5, 1 in 4 chance that it's going to rain that day and at the $8 level. And of course the probabilities decrease as you get lower and lower into the margins. So this is basically inviting you to think about, how much do I care? How worried am I about the 20% chance of rain in November and December? And I would suggest that you should think about that the same way you would think about any risky event. If you came in from shores one night and asked your spouse, hey, do you have a chance to look at the weather forecast for tomorrow? And he or she said, yeah, I did actually. There's a 22% chance of rain. Would you go, oh boy, gosh, you know what? I think we better go out there and pick up that hay, or I think we better go out there and cut that corn? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, but it's that same sort of reasoning. You don't know for sure it's going to rain. In fact, it doesn't sound like it's real likely to rain, but you have to do the mental calculation. What if it did rain? Is that something I'm prepared to risk, or is it something I'm going to do something about? And the same is true with that 22% chance of having a below average margin at the end of next year. In the other parts of the next part of the tool, we calculate what your fees and premiums would be. And again, these are the exact calculation of what USDA would ask you to pay based on your coverage level and percentage of milk covered. And then we calculate an expected payment. Now, just a word about this expected payment. Again, if you knew the price, the margin was going to be $10, you wouldn't expect any payment. But we just looked at a table that said, well, there's a 20% chance it could be less than 8. There's a 17% chance it's going to be less than $7.50. Can I use that information to say, okay, taking all these probabilities into account, what's my expected payment? All of that information considered. And that's what we get when we look at this table. So you see in the middle of the table, it says expected payment, $8, $1,492. Well, obviously, that's a number that you get based on a particular margin level. But what it's saying is, yeah, you know, it could be 10, but it could be 9, it could be 8, it could be 7, it could be 6. And the probability
Andy,
of 6 is
Andy, I hate to interrupt. Getting a little bit of feedback, a couple comments that your voice is kind of fading in and out. I'm not quite sure if that's a technology issue at this end or whatever, but just wanted to mention it. However you're speaking, just keep on speaking up, I guess. So thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for doing that. I was trying to speak up a little louder, but of course I can't hear myself, so I appreciate the feedback. I'm going to raise my volume a little bit, and if it's still not working, I'll see what else I can do. So anyway, this expected payment is by no means a guarantee, but it's information you can use that gives you a sense of how likely is it that we're going to have some sort of payment event. Again, I'm going to draw your attention to these were numbers that we looked at the end of August. I'm going to show you some numbers from today, and you'll find that we're heading south. But the principle here is the same, and now the question of today is, has it risen to a level where I need to take it more seriously? Before I get into that, I want to invite you to think about how can I use this tool given the goals I have, given the market information, market expectations information that I'm getting from that. How can I wrestle with this to come up with a decision? So the tool is giving us some idea of market expectations, market forecasts, and that forecast is updated on a daily basis. Every time the CME closes, we go out there and get that data and refresh our calculations. So, CME goes up, goes down, changes a little bit from day to day, but whatever it is, you'll get the most current information that's available. But it also looks backwards, and this is what I want to do in the next part of the presentation is look backwards. And the reason for that is to help understand how reliable is this estimation procedure. How much stock can I put in to this approach, and how might I adapt my expectations depending on what kind of a year I might be in. Let's do this with the notion that what we're trying to do is maximize net payments. Not so much because it's the best strategy, but just to give us a framework for evaluating a choice you might make when we look back historically. You're going to see three sets of slides that have this kind of organization. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you 3 months of price information, the all milk price, and then I'm showing you the CME margin forecast that is in that red-green graph, and then the blue line is what actually happened. So is the actual margin. So imagine you're looking at the CME on September 30th of 2008, and you want to know what's going to happen in 2009. Using the information from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, we get both the black line, the discrete forecast of the expected margin, but we also get the sense of probabilities. What's the probability it's higher? That's the green part. What's the probability it's lower? And in that fall, late summer of 2008, we certainly knew the market was going to head south. That was our expectation. What the blue line tells us is it went a lot farther south than we ever imagined. And in fact, that same pattern existed in 2012. These were periods, as I'm trying to illustrate in the graph to the left, where we knew the market was heading down. In fact, we were in a reasonable average situation, looking at a situation towards the bottom of the cycle. And what we found is that we tended to be optimistic in a declining market. We didn't think it would get as bad as it did. The implication of that, if we're looking at MPP dairy, is not that we won't get a benefit, but that we risk missing a higher benefit. We could be more aggressive in our coverage election and very much come out ahead, and to a degree greater than just looking at the straight CME numbers would have suggested. So it's not that we made the wrong choice in the sense of not getting a payment, but perhaps more in the sense of we could have made an even better choice had we participated more aggressively. That's the risk when we're overly optimistic in a down market. What about if we're going the other direction? If we're looking at a market that's starting in an average space and moving up. And that would be what we looked at in 2011 and 2014. So these charts are looking at a rising market. Prices are heading up for milk. And our expectations for 2011 and 2014 were generally fairly positive, but they weren't positive enough, or they weren't as positive as the market turned out to be. We were pessimistic in an inclining market. Well, again, it's not so much that we make the wrong choice, because basically our expectation is pretty low of getting a payment, but our risk now is we buy more than we need. This is a time when it probably pays to be conservative, not to be aggressive. There's one possibility still left, and that's when you're from the bottom looking towards the middle, or also from the top looking towards the middle. And what we find is that historically, when the market is moving towards a central point, when we're moving towards average, the CME reflection of buyer and seller prices is actually pretty accurate. We do a pretty good job of predicting the middle. We don't do as good a job of predicting the highs and as good a job of predicting the lows, but we project the middle pretty well. So the black line and the blue line, they're pretty close. When the farther out you get, the little bit more of a mistake you're likely to make. But in that case, it's pretty close. And in this case, there is some risk that you won't buy enough coverage. But I think the key takeaway is when we're looking towards an average year, the CME is probably at its most reliable. It begs the question then, where are we today? And in fact, today, we are at the top of the cycle looking towards the next middle. So based on what I just said, these CME markets should be pretty close. Historically, at least, it's the pattern that we're pretty good at guessing the middle. But let me draw your attention to how our opinion of this middle has changed over the last couple of months or even a couple of weeks. If you look at the footnote, you'll see these numbers are based on yesterday's market, 6th of November. And if you kind of remember the numbers that I showed you earlier, which of course you can look at when you, if you decide to replay the PowerPoints, instead of having numbers on the top line expected of $10 and plus, we're now looking at a lot of $9 prices. Now again, if the margin is 904, you get no payment on an $8 program. So if you believed it was going to be $9, you would still choose not to participate in the program. But look at those percentages. In that previous slide where I showed a similar table, the only number that was above 20% was in that November-December period for $8 coverage. Now you've got 20% numbers all over the place, and you have next May-June, you've got a 1 out of 3 chance of getting a payment if you sign up for $8. So not at all unexpected, the market has moved farther south, but it's also happening faster. So instead of saying this is going to start hitting towards the end of 2015, it actually is now accelerating to much more towards the front of 2015. And I think this gives a lot more reason for folks to consider whether or not they can tolerate that kind of risk in 2015, and in fact they want to take advantage of MPP dairy. Now I would also draw your attention to the fact that the probability of getting a payment at the $4 coverage is essentially 0. So for folks who are saying at least sign up for $4 coverage, okay, fine, you know, that's a point of view, but if you sign up for $4 coverage, and your hope is that you'll at least get your premium back. This table would say you're not going to get $100 back at $4, and you're not going to get your small premium back at $4.50 or $5. And if you do, in fact, want to at least recover your premium or even get a benefit greater than your premium, you got to go in fairly big. Again, I'm not endorsing this as, you need to think of this as a lottery. But if you bring that to the table and say, I would like that outcome, then you got to be prepared to go big. If you want to approach this purely from a risk management perspective, and you say 650 is what I need to cover, fine. Pick 650 with the understanding that you will very likely pay more in premiums than you get back in benefits, and you may get nothing back in benefits. So that's how I would interpret this table and how I would say you can use it depending on what your goals are. Whatever you decide to do with MPP Dairy, one thing that this table is clearly showing is that we're heading south in the 2015, and we're going to get there a lot sooner than we thought. Now keep in mind, the average margin over the last 10, 15 years has been a little over $8. So this is not a catastrophic scenario. In fact, it's much more of an average return scenario, but certainly it's going to feel a lot different than 2014. I've told you that the CME sometimes underestimates, sometimes overestimates, sometimes looks pretty good. Should you translate that into saying, boy, I don't know if I even want to take a look at this, and I would say, oh, no. This is still as good as it gets, but perhaps you can use this insight, this interpretation as a way to make your own sort of mental adjustment about what the market risk is when you're looking at a up year or a down year, or in this case, a year that looks to be heading towards a more average type return. I want to go back to these strategies, and I'll pick out a couple to illustrate for you the possibilities that might present themselves if you choose a couple strategies that I think actually might be fairly popular. First of all, let's establish the outlier. Let's establish, the benchmark is, what's the best you could have done if your objective was to maximize your net benefit. Obviously, hindsight is always 20/20. You couldn't expect to do this, but it does give us sort of as good as it gets scenario. We're looking at 2005 to 2014. We're looking at two farm situations, a 175 cow farm and a 1,000 cow farm. The specific numbers, the particular farm sizes don't make that much difference, but what it means is in the 175 cow column, you have all tier 1 premiums, the lowest premium structure. When you get to 1,000 cows, they still have, the first 4 million pounds of coverage is a tier 1, but they're paying a lot of tier 2 premiums. One of the things that's interesting about this table is that the benefit maximizing decision is the same for both of these farms with only one exception, 2006. And that decision is to be either all in or all out. You either pick $4, you pick $8. So if you're in a year when you're not going to get payments, you want to lose the least amount as possible, that's your $100 fee for the $4 program. In the year that you're going to get a benefit, this is saying you want to get the maximum dollar per hundredweight benefit. Even though the premiums are higher, it makes sense to pick $8. And the only year where that wasn't true in this time frame was 2006, where the tier 2 premium farm should pick 4, but the tier 1 premium farm should pick 8. That by itself is a pretty interesting result. Even though the premiums are a lot higher in tier 2, you almost always end up having the same optimal decision. What's the benefit of those decisions? The average per hundredweight payment over this decade for the smaller farm, the 175 cow farm, the tier 1 farm, is 56 cents a hundredweight. For the Tier 2 farm, it's 37 cents a hundredweight. They're paying more premiums. Obviously, their net benefit is lower. In both cases, I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not 56 cents sounds like a pretty good deal or 37 cents sounds like a pretty good deal. But one thing you could certainly say is that if you stay in the program, if you stick in it, you have the opportunity to make a net benefit. It's not at all impossible to imagine that happening. Obviously, there's no guarantee that in the next 4 years it's going to add up to 56 cents or 37 cents. This is looking backwards. But I would say the probability, the likelihood of a positive benefit would continue to be high going forward. This next table looks at two alternative strategies. I'm looking at the 1,000-cow farm, not so much because I think it's normal or better or whatever, but it's actually the one that's most pessimistic because it's the Tier 2 higher levels of premiums. And the two strategies, we're looking at the revenue maximizing one, that's our upward limit, but we're looking at two alternative strategies. The one we call pick and hold is just pick 650. You make a decision, this is a level that I think makes sense. You say, it's too complicated to figure out what's going to happen next year. I'm just going to go in at the same number. Now, some folks would say pick 4. Some folks would say pick some other number. I picked 650, and I think actually there's a fair number of folks that think 650 is might be one of those appealing choices. So anyway, I just picked it. Well, if you do that over this particular time frame with those particular margin results, you cut your net benefit by almost a third, not quite a third, to 14 cents a hundredweight. Pretty significant reduction, but it's still positive. So this would say, you know what, you're going to have some years where you pay some pretty big premiums and you get nothing to show for it. But if you stick in there, you'll probably get some other years when the net benefit more than compensates for those years when you paid big premiums. The third strategy here I'm calling pick and roll. And that one says, okay, I've decided I like 650. That's my number. In the years that I want to participate, that's what I'm going to pick. But you know what? There's some years when I'm pretty sure it's going to be a good year. I'm pretty sure we're not going to have a low margin. And in those years, I'm just going to sign up for the catastrophic level because that's what the minimum I can sign up for. And so what that basically does is it doesn't get you any higher benefit in the years you have a benefit, but it minimizes your losses in the years when there is no payout. And now you've more than recouped halfway towards that optimal revenue maximizing premium. You've taken your 14 cents a hundredweight up to 28 cents a hundredweight, a pretty significant increase. And I think this could be a strategy that a lot of farmers would find appealing. When the tool or my common sense or anybody else suggests to me probability of a payout's pretty small, fine. Take the minimum and call it good. And in those years when you're going to participate, find the level that you're comfortable with, and you'll probably come out ahead if you stick with that strategy consistently. All right, let's spend a few minutes thinking not about how to maximize my net benefit, but how to think about a more calculated risk management approach. We looked at this graph before, and the point that I made was that, yes, there is a kind of a loose correlation between any individual farm's income over feed cost with this national number. They tend to move together, but your actual number is going to be different from one farm to the next, and for any one farm from 1 year to the next. And that's something that is definitely worth paying some close attention to. Of course, in the language of risk management, what we're talking about is basis. How does my price relate to a benchmark price? How does my price of corn relate to a price of national average or an Illinois price or any other kind of benchmark? And how do they move from one year to the next? And if we want to do risk management in a complete and calculated way, it's important to understand what is my income over feed cost and how does it relate to that number, so that when you say, I'm going to buy $6.50 under MPP dairy, that you really have a pretty good estimate of what that means for your own income over feed cost. Now again, that relationship flexes. That relationship isn't by any means locked in one-to-one. So when we talk about basis, it's not only farm to farm, but my farm from one year to the next. And so it's a bit of a moving target, but nevertheless, analyzing how those move together is only going to improve your ability to make a good decision. I probably don't need to make a lengthy discussion of why we might want to get involved in risk management and think about that in a careful way, but let me simply hit the highlights of saying evaluating what risk you can bear and what risk goes beyond your ability to bear is at the root of a risk management strategy. And understanding, is my concern about solvency, is my concern about liquidity, or some other measure, is one of the fundamental keys in defining what your risk management goals and risk management solutions would be. I would suggest, for example, that whether you choose a high-level threshold, dollars per hundredweight, and a lower level of quantity coverage versus the alternative of a lower dollar per hundredweight threshold and a higher quantity coverage, could be sensible depending on what risk it is you're trying to protect against. You could make different choices. You could say, I'm doing risk management, but have a different risk solution depending on the particular risk that you think you're facing. This, of course, requires you to go through the entire perspective of evaluating what it is that is going to give you stress on your particular farm. MPP Dairy focuses on margin, so certainly you would want to take a look at what your margin situation is, but probably the question you're asking yourself is, at these different levels of margin, what does that mean for my cash flow? What does that mean for my debt repayment capability? I want to take a look at two basic risk concerns, liquidity and solvency. And we're going to look at current ratio and debt to asset ratio as some common measures of liquidity and solvency concerns. And we're going to take a look at two particular farms, Farm 1, Farm 2. Farm 1 happens to be 161 cows, Farm 2, 324, a little different productivity, different structure. That's not essential. Those differences are really not the point. But these are two actual farms from farm records information that we have. And if you look at the income over feed cost in the middle of the table, highlighted in blue, you can see these two farms have very, very similar income over feed cost averages for this 2008 to 2013 period. Farm 1 is $6.03. Farm number 2 is $6.31. For point of comparison, the U.S. margin for this same time period is actually $7.12, so roughly $1 higher than these two farms. So right away, you've got a basis difference, if you will, of roughly $1 minus $1 for these individual farms. However, although these farms have very similar income over feed costs, they happen to have very different debt to asset ratio and current ratio. Farm 1 is in a pretty good situation in terms of debt, very good situation, but its running much more closer to the line in terms of current income versus current expenses, whereas farm number 2 is in a good situation with its liquidity, but it's on a borderline with respect to solvency issues. Well, how might these two farms consider an MPP dairy decision given these different characteristics? Farm number 1 has a liquidity issue, not really a debt solvency issue. Farm number 2, quite the other way. I would suggest a couple of things. One is MPP dairy is unlikely to be the only solution by itself, and obviously you need to look at other risk management tools that would be available and figure out how they would fit in. But if MPP dairy is a part of that, maybe in an issue where you've got liquidity and you want to be sure you have cash, maybe you're more benefited by taking a look at a higher dollar threshold, even if it is at a lower percentage of your milk volume. If the issue is more of a solvency, you've got enough money to pay the bills, but you don't want to get into an issue where you have to borrow more money, then maybe your concern is I need to have a broader coverage of my milk volume, even if that comes at the expense of taking a lower threshold. Needless to say, it's dangerous to make real general conclusions without any more details and analysis, but perhaps this will help you kind of think through how you can use this sort of thinking, this sort of perspective, in combination with the choices that are available with MPP dairy. There is a bunch of additional information for those of you that want to dig into it further. I would draw your attention to two different things. There is a section of our dairymarkets.org website which shows written materials that are available, and one set of those written materials are called MPP decision guides, including some short, I think pretty easy to read publications with titles like Comparison of 3 Participation Strategies for a 100-cow farm, for a 500-cow farm, for a 2,500 cow farm. So hopefully, if you want to dig into a little more detail for a farm that might look a little closer to your own, we've got some additional information here to kind of maybe perk your thinking up a little bit. There's a publication that takes a look at personal income over feed costs relative to MPP dairy and how you might deal with the fact that those things are a little bit of moving targets. And so I would invite you to take advantage of those materials if you want to get some more information. There's also another presentation online that my colleague Maren Bozich from the University of Minnesota put together that is a much more detailed description and analysis of risk management strategies that a producer might want to think about. It does a very detailed explanation of LGM dairy as a particular risk management tool, but it also talks about puts and calls as a different way of thinking about risk management and how that might be combined with an MPP dairy for people who wanted to get into more sophisticated risk management strategies. So those are online, those are available to you, and I would certainly invite you to take a look at those if you're interested in getting into more detail. And as you can guess from this last slide, I've concluded my formal remarks, and if you've got any kind of questions, I would be very happy to try to provide answers or point you in a direction where you can get some answers. Thanks again.
Thank you, Andy. Great presentation, a lot of insightful information, great perspectives throughout it. We do have some questions. I would invite more questions from those participating. Please text chat your questions in. First question, Andy, that came in. How will organic producers take advantage of the program? Is there any different perspective that you would provide for organic producers?
Well, you know, I think, again, this really gets back to the question of what do you want to get out of the program? Whether you're organic or grazing or Jersey or farmstead cheesemaker, you could still look at this and say, is there an opportunity for me to get a net benefit? Never mind what's going on my farm. And I feel semi-guilty suggesting that you might want to game the program, but the fact of the matter remains that it's a choice you have, and you might want to think about whether or not you want to do that. For the organic producer in particular, I think the big obvious question that raises is organic growers have a very different milk price scenario and a very different feed cost scenario, and probably have somewhat different kinds of volatility and movements. In the past, often those movements were more step function, more clunky. They didn't change so much one month to the next, but you could take a big leap at a point in time. This really challenges the organic grower's ability to figure out what their basis is. It makes it a lot harder to do a normal risk management type of an approach. But of course, the fact of the matter is that's true whether you're using hedges or options for risk management. So MPP dairy isn't any worse than the other risk management tools in adapting to an organic situation. I think there is an opportunity for the organic grower to take advantage of this program. If they want to get into risk management mode, it's going to be a little bit harder, but they definitely could get net benefits, and chances are they would get a net benefit in a period when they appreciated having it.
Very good. Next question is, how do you do an apples-to-apples comparison of the margins between MPP and LGM dairy?
You can't, for several reasons. Obviously, with LGM dairy, you're looking at a Class 3 price versus an all-milk price. With LGM dairy and MPP, you're looking at a corn price. It's not quite exactly the same corn price, but it is a corn price. When you look at other feedstuffs, there's no hay in LGM dairy. You got soybeans versus soybean meal. So you're looking at some different numbers. Now, could you approximate the relationship between a Class 3 price and an all-milk price? Oh, yeah, sure. You could, get in the ballpark, but it's not going to be very close, as those of us in the milk business understand. Could you approximate a feed mix in LGM dairy that was pretty close to the feed mix in MPP? Yeah, again, you don't have hay in LGM dairy, but you could, sort of get ballpark. But even if you did that, the key thing that's going to always differentiate LGM dairy versus MPP dairy is LGM dairy premiums vary with risk. MPP dairy premiums are fixed regardless of risk. They're fixed every year. They're the same. So in a year when margins are high, when you expect margins to be good, when you're looking down towards the next year and you see all big numbers on that table, you would find that LGM dairy is pretty cost effective. If you wanted to protect a $10 margin against the possibility of a $9 event, LGM dairy would be probably a pretty good deal. But if you're in a market where the expectation is that you're at 8 and you might go to 6, you can't protect at an $8 level with LGM dairy. It won't even be a choice, whereas it's always available for MPP. So that's the challenge in trying to compare the two. You can come up with, a basket that looks similar, but the pricing over a period of years is going to be very different. And of course, LGM dairy over the long haul is going to be quite a bit more expensive.
Next question, Andy. Reads as follows. Most of the examples look at 90% coverage at different margin levels. What do you think of the strategy of opting for a lower percentage coverage at a higher margin?
Well, I think there's two reasons why you might give that thought. One is you're engaged in some other risk management strategy, and you have either through a hedge or through options or through a forward contract arrangement, you've got protection on 50% of your milk volume. And you might say, okay, I'm going to use MPP dairy to give me coverage on the other 50% or 40 or some component like that. So that could be one way of thinking about a percentage less than 90%, that you're doing two different strategies that add up to covering your whole milk supply. The second thing is, as I mentioned in the presentation, if you feel like you can't just go $8 and 90% across the board, that you've got to make a trade-off, then I think there's a clear choice between covering all your milk or most of it at a lower dollar per hundredweight threshold or covering less of your milk at a higher dollar per hundredweight threshold. And as I suggested in that last part, if your issue is liquidity versus solvency, you might in fact very rationally make a choice between how much milk you cover versus how big the threshold is. And so either one of those issues, the combination of risk management or the type of risk, could very sensibly allow you to pick something less than 90%.
Okay. Again, I would invite participants to text chat any questions in. We have one or two more here, and Andy, at the end, we will ask for any final thoughts that you have. But next question is, with current feed cost, approximately how far does the current farm milk price need to drop to get to the $8 margin?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and the bad news is I don't know the answer to it, but the good news is my colleague John Newton at the University of Illinois has just published a tool that's available on our dairymarkets.org website. It's also available on the University of Illinois website that does exactly that calculation. It's kind of the break-even milk price calculation. So I would invite you to go to the dairymarkets.org website. I think you'll find it pretty close to the top. If you go to the home page, I think we're putting a little plug-in for John's tool on the first page, and it's also available on the MPP dairy website, that particular calculation. I think one thing I can say is the price of milk has got to drop quite a bit more in order to hit that $8 threshold, because we're looking in 2015 at these expected values of $9, and that's building in a $5 to $7 drop in the price of milk relative to current levels. So there's a lot of room south before we see an $8 margin.
Andy, just a technical question. Could you review what producers need to sign up? It's December.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, please.
So the deadline for signing up is now December 5th, a one-week extension relative to what they first announced. There are two forms to fill out. The first form is, they call it 781, and it's basically you put the name of your farm on the form. You put down what is your commercial marketings of milk for 2011, 2012, and 2013, and sign your name. Take it into the office. They'll add some more boilerplate stuff and tell you what your production history is. For most farmers, it's just going to be the biggest number between 2011 and 2013. I think almost every co-op in the country is providing that information to their producers to make it as simple as possible. If a producer does not have a full year of milk production in 2013 and presumably nothing in 2011 or 2012, there is a procedure for taking whatever information they do have and extrapolating it to a one-year equivalent. I won't go into those particular details, but rest assured if there is a recently started business out there, they do have an opportunity to establish a base. It's just a little different format. That's pretty simple, and it doesn't cost you anything to do that. You can do that now, no problem. The second part is the one where you got to scratch your head and figure out what dollar per hundredweight threshold you pick and what percentage of your production history you pick. Check off two boxes. One is dollars per hundredweight, the other box is percentage. Get every producer who is an owner of that farm operation to agree to that choice, and take the form into your FSA office, give them $100, and you're all set to go. Obviously, if you pick more than the catastrophic coverage, you're going to have to pay a premium, and there are two payment options available, one of which is paying it all up at front, which actually in 2014 might make some sense.
Okay. We just had another question on LGM and MPP. If you had LGM coverage March to October 2015, can you get MPP coverage for January, February 2015?
No. So because this is a transition year, and obviously there will be people who have already signed LGM dairy contracts, USDA has said that's fine. You can sign up for the 2015 program, but you cannot participate in an MPP benefit until after your LGM dairy contract expires. So if you had a LGM dairy contract that expired in October, you would be eligible for an MPP benefit in November and December, but nothing before November.
So with that, Andy, you would be signing up by December 6th for the MPP that would not potentially have any impact until after the LGM contract runs out in October, correct? You would be signing up, though, now for the MPP. Is that
exactly.
Correct?
Exactly. If you didn't sign up during this time period, if you didn't sign up by December 5th, then you're not in the program at all. And you could, of course, sign up for the 2016 program, but you would miss any uncovered part of 2015.
I would just note that the producer noted that that's not very fair provision in the program, and we appreciate that interest for sure. Andy, I think you covered all the questions here. I'm just double checking, but any last thoughts that you have? Future sign-ups, the dates will be announced, correct? It'll be the late part of the summer, early fall. Is that right? And for the 2016 or 17 programs, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. If a farmer is in the FSA database, they're an FSA program participant, whether it's MPP dairy or not, they will get a letter from FSA on May 1st that will say, number one, here's a reminder, MPP dairy sign-up will begin on July 1st. Number two, here is the bump for 2016. You might remember that the Secretary of Agriculture has the authority to increase every producer's production history by a percentage that corresponds to the national increase in production. That's called the bump. So on May 1st, you'll be told what your bump is. And on May 1st, they will also say what production per cow factor will be used to determine the production history for a new operation under one of the alternative ways to establish production history for a new operation. So you get that letter on May 1, and then from July 1 until the end of September, you have the opportunity to sign up for the calendar year 2016 program.
Andy, I think you have wrapped it up. Any last comments, thoughts that you have today? No more questions.
Yeah, I do. One thing I want to reiterate, and I'm sure everybody in the business is noticing it, but I'm going to reiterate it anyway. This tool that we've provided, I think, is offering farmers information about what's coming down the road that is very different from anything that's been available before. There's all kinds of folks that have been doing price forecasts. There's all kinds of price forecasts that say, well, price of corn could be as low as 3 1/4 or as high as 3.75. But this is the first time we've really seen market information that does this careful probabilities calculation and lets us look at these expected values. It's the first time that we can see a table that says there's a 32% chance that this particular margin calculation is going to go below 8. And I would suggest that this information, I think, can be useful for planning whether you use MPP dairy or not. And I think it's a reason to take a look at 2015, not with alarm, but certainly with caution, because we know it's moving south. It won't be catastrophic, but it'll be worth planning for.
I'll tell you, that's great perspective, great insights, great information. Andy, I think this is the third time that you've taken your time out to do a webinar for us and on this subject. We have you every year on other subject areas, but we greatly appreciate the efforts and time that you have made to do this. I've heard great comments around the countryside and some of your in-person programs as well, and so thank you so much for everything you're doing. I would just note that this presentation, both the recording of the webinar as well as the slides, PowerPoint slides, are available at farmcrediteast.com. I would also bring to your attention on your screen right now 2 things that we would encourage folks to consider. First of all, we have a survey out there on regulations, state and local regulations impacting on agriculture. We're trying to develop a report with on the regulatory impact to agriculture of various regulations. So we would love input from the producers participating today. And again, you can get to that by going to farmcrediteast.com. And there is more information on farmcrediteast.com, the Farm Bill page there, including various presentations like this recording, as well as information on the open comment period that's currently out there, where USDA is seeking input on the MPP program and on the intergenerational transfer question issue there. So anyway, with that, I want to thank all the participants. At Farm Credit East, we greatly appreciate the involvement of folks on these seminar, webinar presentations. Great questions today. Tough issue, very involved issue. Andy, again, we greatly appreciate your impact. Everybody, have a great day. I hope the weather clears in some areas right now, but have a great day, great weekend. Thank you for participating. If you want to see this website or have any, I should say, recording of this webinar or have any suggestions for future webinars, please get a hold of Chris Lawton, our Director of Knowledge Exchange. So with that, thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.